3 weeks, $80,000. A team of 6 consultants flown in from 2 different states, and a restored 1965 Shelby Cobra that still wouldn't fire. Renata Voss had built her logistics company from a single leased truck and a spreadsheet on a second-hand laptop. By the time she was 34, Voss Freight Solutions operated a fleet of 47 vehicles across the Pacific Northwest, and her name appeared in the Regional Business Journal's annual list of women to watch, which she had read once and never mentioned again. She was not the kind of person who kept trophies. She was the kind of person who kept moving. The Cobra was the one exception to that. She had found it at an estate sale in Bend 3 years ago, under a tarp in a detached garage, covered in the particular kind of dust that accumulates when something has been sitting for longer than anyone intended. The previous owner had been a retired civil engineer named Harold Beach, who had spent 11 years restoring it and another 6 driving it on summer weekends, before his health made that impossible. His daughter, who lived in Portland and knew nothing about cars, and needed the estate settled quickly, had priced it to move. Renata had written the check before she'd finished walking around it. She had never bought anything that impractical in her life. Now it sat in Bay 2 of Cascade Premium Motors, the specialty shop she'd purchased 2 years ago, as an investment property, and now ran as a side operation to her freight business, silent and uncooperative, while the latest expert she'd hired stood in front of it with the specific expression of a man who was about to deliver news he'd been building toward for 4 days. His name was Doyle. First or last, she was never sure. He operated out of Portland, charged $1,100 a day, and had credentials that read like a vintage car collector's wish list. Concourse certified restoration specialist, 40 years of experience with American Muscle. His name appeared in 2 magazines she'd never read, but whose prestige apparently was significant. He had been in her shop for 3 weeks. "We're looking at the carburetor assembly," he said, which was what he had said in week 1, and what he had said in week 2, with different qualifications each time. "Given the age of the fuel delivery system and what we're seeing in the mixture ratios, Doyle." She said it without heat, the way she said most things. "Does the car start or not?" He adjusted his glasses. "We're very close. We were very close 12 days ago." "These things? How much more?" He gave her a number. "It would bring the total to $83,000, not counting the original purchase price of the car, not counting the bay time, not counting the 3 appointments she'd rescheduled to keep his team working uninterrupted." The number landed in the space between them and sat there. Renata looked at the car for a moment, not at Doyle. The Cobra was painted the original Guardsman blue, a color that was almost black in low light and almost electric in sunlight. Harold Beach had matched the original factory shade exactly, which she knew because she'd found his restoration notes in a manila folder in the glove box the day she bought it. 12 pages of handwriting, front and back, materials sourced, decisions made. Problems encountered and solved one at a time over 11 years. Harold Beach had fixed everything about this car, and it had run perfectly for 6 years after that. And now it didn't. "Organize it," she said, "but I want a start by end of week. If this car isn't running by Friday, we're having a different conversation." Doyle nodded, with the particular gravity of a man who understood he was on borrowed time and was making calculations about how much of it remained. She went upstairs to her office and did not throw anything, which took more effort than it would have 6 months ago. Her operations manager, a steady, precise woman named June, knocked twice and let herself in without waiting, which meant what she was carrying was time-sensitive. "There's a situation at the service entrance," June said. "What kind?" "A truck pulled in about 20 minutes ago. Driver says he has a parts delivery for us, but the order number doesn't match anything in the system. Derek told him to wait, and he's still there." Renata glanced at her screen. "Send him away." "We tried." "A beat?" "He saw the Cobra through the bay doors." She looked up. "He asked Derek about it," June continued. "Derek told him it had been down for 3 weeks, and now the driver is saying he might know what's wrong with it." Renata set down her pen. "Where's Doyle?" "That's the thing," June said. "Doyle heard about it. He's down there right now." She heard him before she reached the bottom of the stairs. Doyle's voice had a particular quality when he felt his authority being challenged, not loud exactly, but pressurized, the way a boiler sounds before something gives. The scene assembled itself in a few seconds. Doyle, arms folded, facing a man in a gray work shirt who was holding a clipboard and not particularly looking at Doyle. He was looking at the Cobra. He was maybe 40, lean, with the kind of hands that came from actual physical work over a long time. His shirt had a small logo above the left pocket, something with an anchor. The lettering was too small to read from across the floor. He was studying the car's fuel delivery system, specifically the area around the carburetor, the throttle linkage, what was visible of the intake manifold, with the slow, focused attention of someone running a calculation in their head that nobody else could see. "I'm telling you," Doyle was saying, "we have been through every documented failure point on this chassis. The suggestion that there is some secondary issue with the choke circuit that my team has missed is—" "I didn't say secondary," the man said. His voice was even and unhurried, a Pacific Northwest flatness to it. "I said primary. The choke thermostat on this carburetor variant doesn't behave like the standard 660 CFM unit. It's a 65 specific configuration that Shelby modified for the street version, and it's not in the Holly service documentation that most people work from." Doyle stopped. The room went quiet in the specific way it did when something cut through noise and landed somewhere solid. Renata stepped forward. "Who are you?" The man looked away from the car. His eyes were a direct, steady gray, the color of overcast sky before rain. Not unfriendly, just present, paying attention. "Owen Braddock," he said. "I run a shop out in Ridgefield. I had a delivery routed here by mistake. Looks like a dispatch error. I can get out of your way." "You mentioned the choke thermostat," she said. "I did. What specifically?" Doyle made a sound. "Miss Voss, with respect, I really don't think a parts driver is—" "Owen," she said, without looking at Doyle. "Answer the question." Something shifted in Doyle's expression. He recognized the temperature change. He didn't move, but he stopped talking. Owen looked at the Cobra for a moment, then back at her. "This is the Paxton supercharged version," he said, "which means the choke calibration is running against the blower's increased airflow. In warm conditions, the bimetal spring in the choke thermostat compensates automatically. But this car has been sitting in a climate-controlled bay at what, 68, 70 degrees? 68, Derek said from the edge of the group. Owen nodded once. The spring is calibrated for a car that goes outside. Sits in the cold, warms up, cold, warms up. Consistent thermal cycling keeps the mechanism responsive. But in sustained controlled temperature, the spring loses tension calibration over time. The choke doesn't open fully on ignition sequence. The mixture is too rich to fire cleanly, and the ECU reads a clean ignition signal. So diagnostics show everything normal, but the car doesn't start." He stopped. The service floor was completely quiet. "That's a very specific claim," Doyle said. His voice had changed. There was less pressure in it now, and something that sounded, under the professional surface, like the beginning of recognition. "I know," Owen said. He did not say it defensively. "Where are you getting this?" Owen looked at Doyle for a moment, with the expression of a man deciding how much of this conversation he wanted to have. Then he looked back at the car. "I spent 9 years as a powertrain engineer for a vintage restoration manufacturer in California. We built street-legal replicas of this exact model. Paxton Supercharged 289, same carburetor configuration, same choke variant." He paused. "I've rebuilt the system 31 times. I know what it does when it's been indoors too long." Nobody moved. Then Derek, 22 years old, and constitutionally unable to conceal his reactions, made a small sound that was almost a laugh. Doyle drew himself to full height. "You're saying my team has spent 3 weeks on this car, and the issue is a choke spring." "I'm saying the issue might be a choke spring," Owen said. "I'm also saying it would take about 10 minutes to find out." Renata looked at Doyle. Then she looked at Owen. "What do you need?" He thought for a second. "A heat gun, if you have one. An adjustable spring tension gauge. And someone who can reach the thermostat housing from the passenger side. It's easier from that angle." Derek was already moving toward the tool cabinet. Doyle said, "Miss Voss," in a tone that carried the weight of 3 weeks and $80,000, and a reputation that had just encountered something it wasn't prepared for. "Victor," she said. It was not his name. It did not matter. "Step back." Owen worked quietly. She had watched Doyle's team work. They worked with noise, equipment hum, tablet notifications, the low constant murmur of consultation, the business of expertise made visible and audible. They wanted you to see how hard the problem was. It was the work of people who needed witnesses. Owen didn't seem to notice there were witnesses. He lay down on the creeper without being asked, rolled under the front end, ran the flashlight along the carburetor housing with the slow deliberation of someone who already knew roughly what they were looking for and was simply confirming its location. He was under there for maybe 90 seconds. He said, "There it is," in the tone you'd use for finding your keys on the counter. He sat up, accepted the heat gun from Derek, and spent 3 minutes applying controlled warmth to the choke thermostat housing. Not uniform heat, targeted, specific, in a pattern that suggested he'd done this before and knew exactly which point of the mechanism responded to which temperature gradient. Then he picked up the tension gauge, made 2 adjustments, and reassembled the housing. He stood up and brushed the grit from his shirt. The motion was practical and unself-conscious. He looked at Derek. "Try it." Derek slid into the driver's seat. His hand hesitated on the key for exactly 1 second, which was long enough for everyone in the building to feel the weight of 3 weeks and $80,000 and one parts driver from Ridgefield who had walked in through the wrong door. He turned the key. The Shelby Cobra fired. Not gradually, not tentatively. It fired the way it was supposed to fire, with the particular authority of a 289 cubic inch V8 with a Paxton blower opening up. A sound that was less about volume than about presence. A sound that arrived in your chest and stayed there, and that made the hair on Renata Voss's forearms stand straight up in the way they did every time she heard this engine, which was never enough times. The Cobra sat in Bay 2, idling clean and even and fully itself. Doyle left 20 minutes later. Renata had the conversation with him in the small office off the main floor, and she kept it short and level, which was harder than raising her voice would have been. She told him the final invoice was under review. She told him Marcus would be in touch. She used the name of an operations person who did not actually exist, because she needed a name to put distance between herself and the next 30 seconds. He was not a dishonest man. That was the thing she sat with after he was gone, standing alone in the conference room, looking at nothing in particular. He had worked hard. He had applied everything he knew to the problem. He had simply been working from the wrong documentation, the standard service manual that didn't account for the Paxton variant, the choke configuration that Shelby had modified for street use, in a run that most specialists had never worked on. He couldn't have found it, because he didn't know it was there. She had paid $80,000 for the right effort aimed at the wrong target. She went back out to the service floor. Owen was at his truck, a dark green Silverado that had a good 100,000 miles on it and a toolbox built into the bed that was clearly custom fabricated by someone who knew exactly what they needed and had built the storage around the tools rather than the other way around. He was loading his clipboard into the cab with the efficient movements of someone who had somewhere else to be and was already thinking about it. "Owen!" He turned. That same attentive, unhurried quality, not guarded, just present. "You're leaving. Still have the original delivery to sort out. My dispatcher is going to have questions." A brief pause. Something at the corner of his mouth that was almost a smile. "I have questions too. I'd like to offer you a consulting arrangement," she said. "The Cobra needs a full thermal cycling protocol. She should be driven in the cold, short runs. Let the choke calibrate against real conditions before I take her on the road. I want someone who understands this specific configuration to sign off on it." He looked at her steadily. "What are you offering?" "Name a rate." He considered that. Not performing the consideration. Actually doing it. "I charge $240 an hour for specialty consultation. This would be what, 6-8 hours over 2 weeks? I'll authorize 12. He looked at her for a moment, then at the Cobra, still idling in Bay 2, its exhaust a low steady note under everything. "I'll need to move some things around at the shop," he said finally. "I'll cover any disruption costs." He nodded. Brief, once. "All right." He held out his hand. She shook it. His palm was rough in the specific way of hands that had been doing real physical work for years, and his grip was firm without demonstrating anything. It was just a handshake. It was also the most straightforward handshake she could remember exchanging in some time. "I'll have the paperwork over tonight," she said. "That works." He turned back to the truck, then stopped with one hand on the door. "The car," he said, not turning around. "You bought it as is from an estate. You've never driven it." It wasn't quite a question. "No," she said. "Why does it matter to you the way it does?" She paused. The service floor was quiet now except for the Cobra. I found the previous owner's restoration notes in the glove box. 12 pages. 11 years of his work. Everything he thought about and figured out and got wrong and fixed. She stopped. He's dead. His daughter didn't want any of it. The car was about to go to an auction house where someone would have paid too much for it and put it in a collection. She looked at it. I didn't want that to happen to his work. Owen was quiet for a moment. That's a good reason, he said. He got in the truck. She stood in the service entrance and watched him pull out, the Silverado navigating the lot with the careful patience of a man who didn't rush, because rushing had never actually gotten him anywhere faster than he needed to be. And she noticed that his truck was the cleanest running vehicle she'd seen in the lot that week, which told her something. The Cobra was still idling in Bay 2. She could hear it from the doorway, low and steady and alive. She stood there a moment longer than she needed to. The contract came back, signed at 6:47 that evening, faster than her lawyer turned around documents, faster than her freight clients responded to rate quotes. The signature was compact and legible, the handwriting of someone who filled out work orders by hand every day and had made peace with their penmanship years ago. She looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at the Cobra, which Derek had moved to the parking structure for the night, and thought about 11 years of restoration notes and a man who had solved every problem in that car, one at a time, and left a paper record of all of it, because he understood that the knowledge was worth keeping. She thought about Owen Braddock knowing the choke spring configuration, by number, by behavior, by what it did in controlled temperature versus cold cycling, because he had rebuilt it 31 times in another life. He hadn't put it down when he left that life. He'd just taken it somewhere quieter. She closed the contract file and opened the weekly logistics reports, which needed her attention, and got it. The freight business was real, and it required her, and she gave it what it required. But the reports took longer than they usually did. The thermal cycling protocol took 11 days, which was 3 days longer than Owen had estimated, because Ridgefield ran cold in late October, and they pushed the protocol farther than originally planned, taking the Cobra out in temperatures down to 41 degrees to test the choke response under genuine cold start conditions rather than simulated ones. Owen drove it twice. She drove it the other times, with him in the passenger seat, watching the tachometer and the choke position indicator he'd mounted temporarily on the dash, calling out when to ease the throttle and when to push it, his voice the same unhurried, steady thing whether the engine was responding correctly or doing something unexpected. It always responded correctly. On the fourth outing, a Tuesday morning at 7:15, when the temperature was 43, and the Cascade foothills were doing their particular gray October thing, she pushed the car up to 70 on a clear stretch of Route 503, and the engine opened up in that way. It did when everything was working right. All that contained American violence suddenly not contained anymore, and Owen said, "There!" Just the one word, because the choke position had settled exactly where it should be, and she felt the specific satisfaction of a problem that had been solved correctly. "How does it feel?" he asked. "Right," she said, which wasn't a word she used for things very often. "It feels right." She heard him make a sound that wasn't quite agreement, but was something in the same territory. On the way back, he said, "I should tell you something about the car." She glanced at him. "Harold Beach," he said, "the man who restored it." She kept her eyes on the road. "You knew him?" "I knew of him. He was in the same collector community before I moved north. He presented the car at the Willamette Valley Concours in 2019. I was there. I walked past it 3 times. A pause. It was the best street restoration at the show. Renata drove for a moment without speaking. "He won that year," Owen said. "I remember because he had a folder of restoration notes with him that he kept showing anyone who would look. 12 pages of handwriting. Front and back," she said. "Front and back," he agreed. She kept her eyes on the 503 ahead of her, the road curving through second growth, fir and cedar, the mountains somewhere above the cloud ceiling doing their permanent present thing. "That's why the car matters to you," Owen said. It was not a question this time. "One of the reasons," she said. He didn't push on what the other reasons were, which she noticed and filed in the part of her mind that cataloged things about people. The shop he ran was called Braddock Automotive, which she learned from the paperwork, and which she looked up that evening on a laptop she told herself she was using for a vendor search. The website was simple and honest. The kind of site built by someone who understood they didn't need the site to do much because their reputation did the work the site was supposed to do. It listed services. It listed hours. There was a single photograph of the garage front, dark green siding, a small hand-painted sign, the kind that took more effort than a printed one and cost less and lasted longer. There were reviews. She read enough of them to understand what kind of shop it was. People drove 40 minutes out of their way. People brought cars they'd owned for 30 years and trusted things to Owen Braddock they hadn't trusted to anyone else. One reviewer, a retired firefighter from Camas, wrote 2 paragraphs about an engine problem he'd been trying to solve for 7 years and what it meant that someone had finally taken the time to actually find it. The review ended. "He knows what he's doing and he's straight with you about it. I don't know what else you want in a mechanic." She closed the laptop. She opened her email. She had 26 unread messages. She answered 16 of them and put the rest off until morning, which was unusual because she didn't generally put things off until morning. The protocol was officially complete on a Thursday. Owen wrote it up in his notebook, the same small one with the worn cloth cover she'd seen him using throughout, and typed a summary for her file on what he'd done and what she should watch for over the first winter and how to handle cold starts correctly through February. The document was 2 pages. It was precisely as long as it needed to be. He handed it to her in the bay, the Cobra behind them fully warm. "She's done," he said. "She's done," Renata agreed. He looked at her for a moment with that same direct attention she'd gotten used to without entirely planning to. "The notes," he said. "Harold's notes. Do you still have them?" "In the glove box where I found them," he nodded. "That's where they should be." She looked at him. "You could look at them if you wanted, the next time you're here." It was not a professional offer. She heard that as she said it, and she didn't walk it back. Owen was quiet for a moment. He had a particular kind of quiet, the kind that didn't feel like silence so much as deliberation, the sound of a man who said what he meant and took the time required to know what that was before he said it. "I'd like that," he said. His voice carried something she hadn't heard in it before. Not lighter exactly, but less weighted, as though a door had opened inward somewhere. She had dinner with a colleague that evening, a freight broker named Gordon, who talked too much and meant well, and she was back in her apartment by 9. The city outside her window was doing what it did on Thursday nights, occupied and ordinary, the rain that had started at 6 still going, the streetlights doing their reflected thing on the wet pavement below. She thought about what it meant to carry knowledge you'd built in another life, to still have it with you when the life changed. She thought about 31 rebuilt carburetors. She thought about a man who had walked away from an engineering career and driven north with a 6-year-old in the back seat and built something smaller and entirely his own. And about the particular kind of courage that was not dramatic and did not announce itself and just showed up every morning and did the work. She called the shop on a Monday. She told herself she had a question about winter storage, which was true, mostly, and dialed the main line. He answered on the second ring. "Braddock Automotive. It's Renata Voss." A beat. The settling sound. "Hey, something with the Cobra." "Storage question," she said. "You mentioned in the protocol document the part about battery maintenance over winter. I want to make sure I understand the load cycling recommendation." He walked her through it, specific and clear, the way he explained everything. She wrote it down, which she didn't need to do because she had the document, and she was aware of this about herself, even as she did it. When he finished, she said, "How's the shop?" "Busy," he said. "It's fall. Everyone suddenly remembers their car needs things before the snow." "How's your daughter?" A small pause. Not hesitation, more like adjustment. "She's good," he said, and something in his voice changed the way it changed whenever the subject came up. Less careful, more direct. Younger somehow. "She made the soccer team last week, which was apparently a matter of grave importance. We celebrated with pancakes. Pancakes seem appropriate. She chose the place," he said. "She always chooses the place. I've learned not to have opinions about restaurants. That sounds wise." "It is." A brief sound that was almost a laugh. "She'd tell you I was slow to figure it out." Renata sat at her desk with her hand around her coffee cup and watched the rain on the window and did not look at any of the 17 open tabs on her other monitor. "What's her name?" she asked. "Willa." He said it with the particular unguarded quality that appeared in his voice only when it concerned his daughter. Not the contained, competent person who had showed up at her service entrance and diagnosed a problem in 10 minutes. Someone different. Someone younger and less settled and more willing to be that way. She's 9. She'd tell you 9 3/4. The fraction matters. Enormously, he said. She'd say enormously. The rain ran down the window in long, clean lines. Owen, she said. Yeah, if you brought Willa into town sometime, there's a place near the waterfront that does breakfast. Nothing special. But the coffee is better than it has any right to be. There was quiet for a moment. Not awkward. The deliberate kind. That's not really a storage question, he said. No, she said. It isn't. Another pause. She could hear something in the background of the shop. A pneumatic ratchet, a radio playing something she couldn't identify. Saturday morning, he said. Saturday morning, she said. The place was called Anchor and Oak, which she hadn't named, which had been there since before she moved to the city, which had the particular worn comfort of a place that had been feeding the same neighborhood for long enough that it knew what it was, and had stopped apologizing for being modest about it. She was there at 8:23. He was already in a corner booth. He was always there before people. She understood by now that this was not a power move, but just how he was wired. Willa Hayes was sitting across from him, with a short stack of pancakes in front of her that she had already requested, and a small notebook of her own, the apple not far from the tree, in which she was writing something with a purple pen. And she looked up when Renata came through the door with the open, frank assessment of a 9-year-old who had decided in advance that she was going to form her own opinion and nothing was going to stop her. Are you the car lady? Willa said. Willa, Owen said. It's okay, Renata said, sliding into the booth. I am the car lady. Willa looked her over. Dad said you have a Cobra. I do. Is it fast? Fast enough. Dad says that about everything fast, Willa said. He says fast enough is the right amount of fast, and faster than that is showing off. She looked at her father. Do you think she's showing off? I think we just met, Owen said evenly. And you're asking about 17 things at once. I only ask one thing. It was one thing with context. Renata looked at her. Willa looked back. She had her father's eyes. Same gray, same directness, but where his was a door kept mostly closed, for good reasons. Hers was a door left fully open, because no one had yet given her a reason to close it. Context is important, Renata said. Willa appeared to approve of this. She went back to her notebook. Owen poured coffee from the carafe on the table and set the cup in front of Renata without being asked, which she noticed. It was a small thing. It was the kind of small thing you only noticed if you were paying attention, and she was paying attention. Sorry about the interrogation, he said. Don't be. She has questions. Questions are good. She has the questions of 6 people compressed into one 9-year-old, he said. It's efficient, but occasionally. Dad said my mom was like that, Willa said, without looking up from her notebook. So I think it's genetic. Owen's expression changed in a way that Renata had not seen before. Not pain exactly. More like the particular settled quality of someone who has learned to carry something heavy for long enough that they've figured out how to carry it without it reading, as weight on their face. Learned how to let something true pass through the room without stopping it and without pretending it wasn't there. She was, he said simply, exactly like that. Willa looked up then, briefly, and looked at her father with a look that was too old for 9 and exactly right for a child who had grown up understanding, in the incomplete but genuine way that children understood things, that someone was missing from the room and had always been missing from the room, and that her father had made the room as full as he could anyway. She looked back at her notebook. What are you writing? Renata asked. Things I want to look up later, Willa said. I keep a list. What's on it right now? Willa considered whether to share this. She apparently decided Renata had earned it. She turned the notebook around. The list had 11 items. Renata read it. It included the load-bearing capacity of suspension bridges, whether crows could recognize individual human faces, how the Coriolis effect worked, and, at the bottom in slightly smaller handwriting, why do old cars smell different than new ones? Renata looked at Owen. She asked me last week, he said. I told her it was a chemistry question and that she should look it up herself, because the answer is more interesting than anything I'd say about it. Is that true? Yes, he said. And I also didn't know the exact answer and didn't want to guess wrong. It was the most self-deprecating thing she'd heard him say, and it landed differently than she expected. Not because it was surprising, but because the way he said it, dry, completely at ease with having not known something, was so straightforward that it reset something in the way she was looking at him. She picked up the menu, though she already knew what she was ordering. The conversation moved the way it moved when nobody was managing it, uneven and occasionally interrupted by Willa, who had the particular gift of asking questions that cut directly to the center of whatever was being discussed and redirected everything into territory none of them had planned on entering. She asked Renata why she ran a freight company and also a car shop when those seemed like two different things. She asked Owen whether he thought the crow question would take longer to research than the suspension respect question. She asked, unprompted, what Harold Beech's restoration notes said about the engine work, because her father had mentioned the notes and she had decided they were interesting. Renata told her about the engine section, the carburetor entries, the 3 attempts Harold had made at the intake manifold gasket before the 4th one held, the single line he'd written on page 9 that said, "Finally got it right. Don't know why this time and not the others. Sometimes that's just what it is." Willa was quiet for a moment after that. "I like that," she said, "that he wrote it down even when he didn't understand it." "Me too," Renata said. Owen was looking at his coffee. Not at Renata, not at Willa, just at his cup, turning it slightly in his hands. She had learned this was how he processed things he found meaningful. Not with eye contact or acknowledgement, but with that small contained motion, the cup turning, the thoughts doing their work inside. She was learning to read the small things. She had not intended to, and she was. The next Saturday happened. Then the one after that. By the 3rd, Willa had started bringing a second notebook specifically for things Renata had said that she wanted to look up, which Owen reported with the expression of a man who had been told something that mattered to him and was still deciding what to do with that information. They were in his shop in Ridgefield on a Tuesday afternoon in November, where Renata had driven the Cobra for the first cold weather check. The temperature was 39. The car had started on the first turn and settled into its idle with the clean confidence of a machine that had been correctly repaired and knew it. Owen ran through the check methodically. She stood to the side and watched. There was a version of herself from a year ago that would have been answering emails while he did this. Standing in the room physically but not present in any real way, half her attention already at the next problem on the list. She had been like that for a long time. Her freight company ran on that quality, the ability to be solving Tuesday's problem on Monday morning, to be perpetually a step ahead of the thing that was about to need her. She was not doing that. She was watching Owen check the choke calibration with a tension gauge. His movements precise and unself-conscious, and she was thinking about a retired civil engineer who had spent 11 years solving the problems in an old car because the problems were worth solving and the knowledge was worth keeping. And she was thinking about what Willa had said. "I like that he wrote it down even when he didn't understand it. You could go bigger with this," she said. Owen didn't look up from the gauge. "With what? The shop, the knowledge." She leaned against the workbench. "You understand systems that most people with your background either left behind or parlay into something corporate. You're out here in Ridgefield doing oil changes for commuters and occasionally restoring something that matters." "The commuters matter too," he said. "I know they do. That's not what I'm saying." He set down the gauge. He looked at her with that direct attention that she had stopped trying to read as anything other than what it was. A man being fully present in a conversation because he was incapable of being otherwise. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I notice things," she said. "I've noticed that Derek has learned more from the 4 hours you've spent in my bay than in a year of working there. I've noticed that every review on your website describes the same thing. Someone who was told something couldn't be fixed, who came to you and who had it fixed. I'm saying you have something that doesn't scale easily, and I understand why you don't want it to scale. But I notice it." He was quiet. The garage was warm and smelled of motor oil and cold metal, the particular combination that meant a place where real work happened. "Does noticing it mean you're going to try to change it?" he asked. "No," she said. "It means I see it." He looked at her for another moment, then something eased in his expression, not relief exactly. More like the relaxation of a man who had been waiting to find out whether a thing was true and had just found out it was. He picked up the gauge again. "The car is good," he said. Drive it cold whenever you can this winter. Let it calibrate. I will. And let me know what Harold's notes say about the brake master cylinder section. I've been thinking about it. You've been thinking about a dead man's brake notes. I've been thinking about how he solved problems, he said. It's the same thing. She drove back to Vancouver on I-205 with the heater running and the window cracked 2 inches because the Cobra's exhaust note at highway speed was something she was not willing to completely seal herself away from. The mountains were somewhere behind the clouds, permanent and invisible, the way important things were when the weather closed in. She thought about systems, about the secondary connections, the ones that ran in parallel to the main architecture, undocumented, unassuming, carrying part of the load without announcing it, the ones that failed quietly at the threshold where tolerance ran out, not in ways that showed up on standard diagnostics, but in ways that a person who had rebuilt the same system 31 times would recognize in 10 minutes. She thought about what it meant to pay attention to those. In January, Owen brought Willa to the shop on a Saturday morning when the Cobra needed its mid-winter check, and Willa wanted to see the car in person, which she had apparently been requesting with increasing specificity since the Anchor and Oak conversation in which she'd learned the notes about the intake manifold gasket. Willa walked around the Cobra 3 times without speaking, which Owen said was unusual and meant she was serious about something. Then she looked at Renata. "Can I read the notes?" she said. Renata got the folder from the glove box and handed it to her. Willa sat on the shop's waiting bench with 12 pages of Harold Beach's handwriting in her lap and read every one of them. Owen and Renata checked the car. The morning moved around them, the shop its ordinary weekday self. 2 other vehicles in the bays, a radio playing something low, the particular compressed warmth of a working garage in winter. When Willa finished, she held the folder carefully in both hands, which was the same way she held her own notebooks, and she looked at the Cobra. "He fixed things that weren't broken yet," she said. "He'd say, 'This will fail in 3 years. Fix it now.'" "How did he know?" "Pattern recognition," Owen said from under the dash, where he was checking the choke indicator mount. "You work on enough systems, you know what's going to give before it gives. Can you learn that?" "It takes time," he said. "And you have to actually pay attention." Willa considered this with the seriousness she applied to everything that seemed worth considering. "Dad pays attention," she said, not to Owen, to Renata. "He pays attention to everything. It's sometimes a lot." "It's a good quality," Renata said. "I know." Willa set the folder on the bench beside her, with the care of someone returning something valuable. "He paid attention to you," she said. And she said it with the matter-of-fact certainty of a 9-year-old who had already worked something out and was simply noting it for the record. Renata looked at Owen. Owen had emerged from under the dash. He was looking at his daughter with the expression he wore only around her, the one where all the containment went somewhere, and what remained was just a person who loved someone without reservation and had stopped being embarrassed about it. "Willa," he said. "I'm just saying," Willa said. "You're saying a lot. You always say I should say what I mean." She picked up her notebook and wrote something. "I'm saying what I mean." The Cobra was checked and cleared. The folder went back into the glove box. Willa asked Renata if she could hear the engine, and Renata started the car and let it idle for 2 minutes while Willa stood with her hand pressed flat on the hood and felt the vibration and listened. "It sounds like it knows something," Willa said. "All old machines do," Renata said. "They've been through enough." Owen was leaning against the workbench with his arms folded and the expression of a man who was exactly where he had decided to be. They drove to a diner Willa had identified as acceptable based on a review she'd found on criteria she declined to specify, but which clearly included the quality of the pancakes. February arrived and then March. The Cobra wintered well. The choke thermostat calibrated against the cold the way Owen had said it would. The bimetal spring finding its correct tension through the thermal cycling, the problem that had cost 3 weeks and $80,000 resolving itself gradually and completely into a car that started every time and ran exactly as Harold Beach had intended it to run when he'd spent 11 years making it that way. Renata drove it on weekend mornings when the weather allowed. Sometimes into the gorge, where the road ran between the Columbia and the basalt, and the light came in at angles that made the Guardsman Blue look like something that couldn't exist in nature. sometimes south through the Willamette Valley, the farmland, opening up flat and bare and enormous in the way it did in early spring, before anything had come back. Once, on a Saturday in late March, she drove it to Ridgefield. Owen's shop was closed on Saturdays, but he was there when she pulled in, a project of his own, something on a lift in the second bay, that she didn't ask about because she understood by now that he had work that was his and it was not her job to explain it to her. He heard the Cobra and came out. He stood in the lot and listened for a moment. "She sounds good," he said. "She's perfect," Renata said. "I want to say she's perfect." He almost smiled. The corner of his mouth. The minimal version that she had learned was worth considerably more than other people's full expressions. "That's what right sounds like," he said. She got out of the car. The March air was still cold, the mountains clear for once. The kind of day that made you feel like you could see to the edge of things. "Willa is at a sleepover," she said. "She sent me a voice message at 7 this morning about the crows." "They can recognize faces," Owen said. "She looked it up in November." "They can," Renata agreed. "She sent me a 5-minute summary." Something moved across his face, uncomplicated and direct. Not the settled, careful expression, not the professional one. Just a man who was glad about something and was not hiding it. "She doesn't do that for a lot of people," he said. "I know," Renata said. "I don't take it lightly." They were quiet for a moment, the mountains visible above the fir line, white and definite against the blue. "I've been thinking," he said. "About the break notes?" "About that," he said. "And about other things." He looked at her in the lot, the morning light doing its imperfect best, and he was not performing anything, and he was not holding anything back. And she understood that this was rare, and that she had been shown it gradually over months, and had paid attention the way she'd been paying attention to small things since October. "Me too," she said. He nodded, just once. The way he did things. "You could come inside," he said. "I have coffee." She locked the Cobra and followed him in. The shop smelled like motor oil and cold air and something clean underneath, and the walls had tools hung in precise rows and a small corkboard near the desk, with a photo of Willa at what looked like a soccer game and a handwritten note she couldn't read from across the room. And in the second bay, the project on the lift was beginning to reveal itself as something old and American and worth the trouble. She looked at it. "What is it?" she said. 1969 Camaro Z28, he said. "Came in from an estate. Owner's son didn't want it. He handed her a coffee cup." She looked at the Z28 on the lift, partly disassembled, its story visible in the way that old cars were readable to people who knew how to read them. The repairs that had been done, and the repairs that had been put off, and the long gaps where the car had simply been used, and the single previous owner who had loved it in the practical, unsentimental way that certain people loved the things they kept, not because they were valuable, but because they worked. "Someone's going to fix it," she said. "Someone already is," he said. She looked at him. He was leaning against the workbench with his coffee, looking at the Z28 with the same expression he'd worn when he looked at the Cobra the first day in her bay, the focused, unhurried attention of a man who saw a problem and already knew most of what there was to know about solving it, and was simply choosing where to begin. She drank her coffee. Outside, the mountains stayed visible, which they did not always do, and the morning held the particular quality of early Pacific Northwest spring, cold and clean and slightly unbelievable, as though the whole thing were too still to be trusted, but was offering itself anyway, and she was choosing to take it at its word.